You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years' experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Hey, welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Our guest today is the founder and director of the Reclaimed project. Bryn has served the young people of West London for the past 17 years in more than 50 schools. Originally a secondary school English teacher, Bryn created the Reclaim project in 2015 as a way of helping young people see for themselves how capable they really are. Regular success across short-term achievable projects grows that sense of capability and capacity, which can alter their educational experience. In Bryn's spare time, he discloses this, people. That's a bit disturbing. And he's eternally hoping that Arsenal can overcome Man City each year. Welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast, Bryn Murphy.
Thank you very much, mate. Well, I could talk at length about the Arsenal and how they.
Well, before we jump into this conversation, I'm a bit of a Gunners fan from a long time ago. I don't really follow hard after soccer, as we call it, but football. But I've always been a Gunners, leaned in towards the Gunners. I thought they were a really fun, exciting group 20, 30 years ago. Anyway, tell me, you're a bit of a Gunners tragic. So what does that look like in the real world for you?
It's one of those horrible things where, Wenger's culture started it when he took over and he was all about creating beautiful football, which I think Arsenal consistently aims for and has more recently been achieving. But, there was a legacy of he wasn't as harsh as the best managers, I don't think, and therefore he allowed people around the club that shouldn't have been for too long, and then they got a bit stuck with like financial things because they built a new stadium, and that meant that eventually they couldn't actually buy the players, and so they just got stuck in this almost team, for years and years, and thankfully Arteta's got a better mentality, but there comes a point where he maybe has a little bit of that left over, and he's been raised by a much better manager under Pep, which I think has helped, but we still seem to. I mean, how do you beat a behemoth like Man City? I mean, it's tricky. It's tricky. So, but we've come close the last 2 years. We missed it by a game this year. But the mistakes made early in the season where you drop one simple game early. It's not about the end games. But one day, mate. One day, maybe this coming year is the year.
I hear you, mate. This is clearly close to your heart. It resonates very deeply in you. I can see that. And if I let you go, you could spend the next 20 minutes.
It's too much of my time. Less of my emotion than it used to. I get less bothered by it now. But
Yeah. So you need some counselling.
Probably, mate. Probably. I think we all do.
We don't. Yeah, we don't offer that at this stage, but I think we might put that in our repertoire moving forward for the football tragics. Mate, look, thanks for joining us again. I really appreciate that, and looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today. But you've not always lived in the UK, have you, mate? I mean, it's you've been around a little bit. So tell us a little bit about your journey from where have you lived, but also the journey into the education space. What does that look like for you over the last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I was born in Melbourne, but we moved to the UK when I was about one. My parents work in the sort of like addiction counselling space, and my parents ran a rehab in London for a number of years. We lived above the rehab.
Oh, wow.
I sort of tend to tell people that I grew up in a rehab, which, I realised communicates something which isn't true. I wasn't in the rehab per se, but we would, share meals with the addicts and go to the swimming pool with them and hang out, and they were part of my childhood growing up. My first and only cigarette was smoked at the back of the house while one of the addicts offered me a cigarette, and I took it as a 9-year-old boy. I think he was clearly trying to teach me not to smoke, because I think he said something, I don't remember clearly, but I think he said something like, yeah, that's why we don't smoke, after I was sort of half choking to death, after one puff. So I haven't touched cigarettes since, actually. The job worked, and I'm sure my parents wouldn't be too happy to hear that. But yeah, I ever since then, I just kind of have this deeply rooted memory built into my brain somewhere about that moment. But yeah, it was amazing growing up with these guys, 80s London, kind of colourful mohawks, leather jackets, the full tilt. And then we moved back to Australia when I was about to start year 7 in 94. And I did high school and uni in Australia, and I did education at uni, became an English teacher, and then decided to come back and just sort of see what life was like here. And then after, as you do, sometimes you sort of are enjoying a space, so you extend your visa a bit and you extend your visa a bit. And over a few years, you find out one day, I live here, sort of by accident. And I kind of initially thought I'd probably come back to Australia at one point and at some point. But again, as life then moves on again, you get married and I have a child now, and you sort of, this is where I live. And so I've ended up kind of I became a British citizen this year for
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sort of settled here now, which I'm in some ways still surprised at. But yeah, I got into education. I've been working. My first year of teaching in London, I taught Chinese language, which I really didn't speak very well, but I needed a job, and there was a French teaching position available, which I said to them, I can't speak French, and they basically said, look, we just need a warm body in the room. Basically the school was failing miserably and getting terrible, like 23% pass rate, at what they call GCSEs here. And so just really, really low. And the head teacher was kind of quite ineffective. And in my second year, I got to move into the English department, and they got a new head teacher, and the school started turning around, which was great. She put a lot of systems in place which are really helpful for the local area and for the type of kid we had at school. And then I taught there, and that was a bit of a baptism of fire, sort of kids throwing desks and chairs or threatening to jump out windows. And my very first day of teaching in London, I was doing supply teaching, and I said to this kid, I want to speak to him after class, and he just sort of gave me the finger, told me to F off, and jumped out a window and ran off somewhere, and I sort of
wow.
That's London, that's this is what it's going to be like.
Baptism of fire, mate.
Yeah, baptism of fire. I very much realised I was extreme, very, very far out of my depth. And, as you do, you make a lot of mistakes and you try strategies that don't work, and then bit by bit you sort of adapt those strategies. And obviously with a lot of that came a lot of stress, not necessarily nice working environment. And then, so by 2015, I had taught enough young people who I felt, talking to them and communicating with them, I felt they probably should be achieving higher than they are in terms of what I could sense off the way their brain works and listening to them and talking to them. But there seemed to be a whole set of other stuff that were getting in the way of their ability to achieve academically, I suppose. And so because that was my impact space, I visualized an idea where I could use some sort of tool to teach these guys that they're very capable. And the core idea was that they would see success on a regular basis that was challenging to them, but actually in practicality quite easy to achieve. And so I sort of needed to
I'm going to jump in there because
go.
I want to that's good, man. No, I really appreciate the candor and the clarity of what you've just shared. I think it's really important. And before we jump into the project itself and unpack some of that, and brilliant work, by the way. And you're also one of the partners on our World Resiliency Day platform, which is something that we value greatly, and we certainly go after people that personify and certainly manifest the things that we hold dear in that context. But we won't talk about that now. But before we jump into your actual project, without going too much back into the addiction being raised in a rehab facility, I think most of our listeners will get this. What informs us as we develop and grow as people, many and varied, and clearly your parents and their involvement in this space, clearly they were committed to it and incredibly important, and obviously aware of the potential impact on their children's lives. You got siblings, is that right, Bryn?
Yep, I've got 3 siblings, that's right.
Okay, so 4 kids, I'm assuming all raised in the same space? Yeah, well, again, so your parents are got 2 fronts to work on: developing a young family, building into them values and resiliency and strength at the same time in an environment that's, arguably could be quite dangerous. The unpredictability of certain, dependency or addiction spaces is quite a volatile space, and that can be really difficult. But navigating that with kids and helping kids navigate that is really, really interesting. And the fact that you only was offered a cigarette by one of the candidates was as bad as it got. It is a testimony to the work that your parents have done, but also that informs, not just that experience with the tobacco, but I'm hearing a resonation that sort of, resonation, a resonance that says, there's something here that's informing the way you see people. Now, can you unpack that a little bit? Did that at any point, and maybe it didn't, but did that at any point during that journey go, wow, these people are complex and there's some stuff going on here that I wonder how they got into this space? Did that ever sort of enter in your head as a kid growing up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wouldn't say consciously, but I definitely think, I have a strong theory around, detriment to me. It is just my theory. I'm sure there's research to back it up out there somewhere, but you can always find research if you want to, but I have a strong theory that exposure is essentially the best teacher, if you can experience stuff. And I think, there's a lot of stuff I read and the things I've seen is experience seems to be life's great teacher. A lot of the young people I work with as they get older, when all the things that they've struggled with when they're sort of young and we as adults find difficult with them in the classroom, they tend to disappear quite fast for the vast majority when they get to adulthood, because life suddenly meets them and goes, that doesn't that doesn't work here. So they
Sure.
adapt, and we all adapt. And so I think growing up, you sort of in that space, I think it was less thinking of a few thoughts around, my dad, again, as we said, it was an addiction counselor. He would talk about, maturity being paused at the age that people started using. So typically, if somebody starts using, sort of beyond the cigarette sort of realm, the maturity he would talk about tends to pause around that thing. Now, those sorts of ideas certainly popped into my head, but I think the real noticeable impact for me was it's sort of just that ethos that's been part of our culture for a good couple of thousand years now of, each individual has value, and that value isn't contingent upon what they do. That value is innate, which is, it's a sort of Christian value that came in the early centuries, where the church was expanding, was the first group of people to sort of, look after the orphan children and those sorts of people and make that a principle and them into universities, etc. So that principle of the individuals, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about as well, didn't he? It's like that if you can base everything on that, then I think that's interesting, the bit that probably led me to go, well, if that's true and somebody has innate value, then how do people end up not treating themselves as if they have value? And then as I started questioning those things, that led me towards the questions that were in my head around that led me towards the creation of the project.
Yeah, brilliant. So again, some of the informing elements there, obviously parental environment, obviously the rehab, and certain values and certain principles in action. And education is a very key part in all this. Education has many different facets, as we know, and the educative process, is such a complex one, and it requires nuance, and depending on the individuals you're dealing with. Now, this is kind of, for me, I mean, if I may insert this into the conversation, this kind of shapes you up, informs you a little bit, and as you head towards your adult, learning space, and as you start moving into the arena of adulthood and vocation and all the things that go with that, all of a sudden you're going, you know what? I think teaching is something valuable, because I don't want to just teach knowledge. I want to teach value. And again, but going back to that sense of, you've stated, using your words, innate value, that's ascribed from, beyond. It's a supracultural ascribing. And so, I hear that. So that, of course, informs you. Now to go to your mission, and I think it's interesting, and I just want to read this for our listeners. The mission is to help students succeed and become productive members of adult society, which chimes in what you said before about young people bumping into the reality of the grown-up world. Young people need to feel both capable and purposeful. It is our responsibility as educators to provide at-risk, disengaged students with opportunities to reclaim their worth, the innate worth that you've just talked about that's been lost for whatever reason. And this way they begin to recognize their capability more fully. Now, I really like that simple mission statement. The question I've got for you, you've been in on a significant and sustained journey in this area, working with marginalised youth. Just one step back, the passion, obviously education, and you bumped into the reality. You went, the passion for deliberately working with marginalised youth, particularly you bumped into some of the behavioural issues. When did that kick in? It was obviously prior to 2015. So when did that sort of the moment go, I need to do something beyond the current setting?
Well, it's a great question. You don't end up in London teaching the roughest kids sort of by accident, except in some ways you do, because there's, you kind of end up teaching where you end up sometimes. But there's other options. There's other pathways you can take as an educator in London. There's plenty of other options, and you can control and design that. But the reality is, I think when I came here in 2007, I had it in my head, and I remember saying to someone, I would teach. I would teach in tougher environments until I ran out of energy to do so. It was sort of my early sort of statement. And I think, wherever you go, you sort of have it on you you have a responsibility to offer people your best if you can. And I think there comes a time where maybe you hand that over to someone else. And I think you have to be real about the environment that will tax you. And so I would say, I would say that, again, I think this has been in me and on me for a number of years, but a long time before moving to London. The idea that I would, I've been working with young people and youth since I was a teenager myself. I helped out in the kids' church when I was in high school, and then I helped out in the youth when I was a young adult. These things are sort of just, I've realistically, since when I was capable, I've been involved. And whatever extent that would have been that would have been created by my environment. You get invited into these spaces by the family and the community you're in, and so
shaped by,
and shaped by, exactly right. And then you either but ultimately, and this is one of the founding principles of everything here, is that you will either engage with that or you won't. I had plenty of other friends join in and do those things and leave quite fast. It wasn't their cup of tea, and so for whatever was there and was built into me. Was there from very early on, but then it really became a productive sort of back 2012. I became very dissatisfied and agitated by a lot of the things going on in school, and I thought, there's a real tricky question around what is the role of an educator. Society will tell you the role of educator is to pretty much do everything. You're supposed to pass to these kids, teach these kids, care for these kids, be their safeguarding,
parent their kids.
Parent their kids. You essentially you expect to do everything. But I would argue that while most teachers get into education to help young people, most of us, I was a 25-year-old young man with no parenting experience who was being asked by parents what I should do for their kids, and it's like, I'm an English teacher. I'm here to teach your kid English. It's actually technically not my job, and that's why I think we need these bolt-on things like what I do now, because I actually don't believe it is the education. I know we're the main protocol and the main time frame for a lot of these kids during the week in terms of hours, but I don't believe principally, and I think it would be quite dangerous if education becomes the place where all values are communicated to young people. I think that's a very risky space. That's my own personal opinion on that system. Bit off topic.
Hey people, just wanted to give you a heads up about a fantastic podcast you should check out. Pathways to Prevention is an inspirational podcast about the best practice journey of substance use prevention and many of the key factors that just make life work better. For in-depth, engaging and exceptional interviews and content, just search Pathways to Prevention podcast. That's Pathways, 2, Prevention, and check it out. Now back to Unnecessary Harm.
No, mate, no, I hear you. And I think the reality of where the teachers want to be, all the multifaceted things they need to be in the particular setting, whether they want to be or not, that's the reality. And the more, dare I say it, dysfunctional a culture becomes, the more demands are put on those who have cold face time with students. So that's again, right. When you've got behavioural issues, again, you cannot educate a student who's not even engaged. So now, again, that leads you into the next space, the next phase of your journey, which is fantastic, because you've not just seen the problem and gone, okay, let's find an easier route to I genuinely want to educate, but I don't want to do it I just want to do the A, B's and C's. I want to do the cognitive domain. I just want to educate students on English or mathematics or history or engineering, whatever it is, which is great. That's fine. That's perfectly normal and right. A teacher should be able to teach curriculum, not parent the child. But you've gone, education requires much more than this. And the affective domain is as imperative as the cognitive domain. And if the affective domain isn't anchored well, then the cognitive domain can't function well anyway. Even if it's just learned by rote, it's still going to miss the mark because students aren't getting the value out of the process of learning. This is a teaching and learning environment. I'm learning life. I'm learning to grow. And so your project then steps into that breach, into that gap, and you become an advocate, an educator, and you become a visionary, as it were. And your mission is now to transcends the standard model, which I'm not going to blow smoke up your skirt, but that's, I think, really important. A lot of people are starting to realize this is what's needed. And the bolt-on thing, I get it. People can see it as scaffolding and bolt-ons, and to some extent that's true. But I think there's more than that. I think that's about positioning yourself and your work to be foundational. Again, revisiting the foundations. And that's one of the key issues we'll maybe talk about later on. But so just on that, I'm going to throw in a curly question here that I've not asked any one of our guests before. So this is the first time I've asked this question. So, Bryn, what does unnecessary harm look like to you in your context? Tell us what unnecessary harm looks like.
That's a great question. I mean, it's the first thing that it sort of comes to the forefront of my mind, and quite with a fair whack of force, is the unnecessary harm that my young people face is all from family. All of it's from family and community. You know, it's an absent parent. It's a parent with alcohol issues. You know, I taught a boy a few years ago who, I mean, I'll give you a very brief description. You know, this boy essentially came to school smelling like cat urine. His clothes were not clean. You know, he was, you know, these are all safeguarding things which you'd pick up on and report on. I mean, the school always tends to know typically when you report it because they've dealt with it before. But, you know, so you sort of ask around and you find out a little bit, and then you find, you know, he looked a bit like a vampire. He was extremely pale, you know, kind of very sort of gaunt, you know, and it turns out he hadn't, you know, no father around, alcoholic mother, and there were two sons, him and his younger brother, you know, and then it turns out his grandma worked in the canteen, and you sort of, you know, lovely lady, and you sort of chat to her a little bit, and you find out that the boy says to me, he's supposed to be doing his GC exams, and he says to me, he's just tired all the time. So I say to his grandma, do you know why this boy's so tired? You know, and she says, well, it's because the younger brother won't turn off the TV in the bedroom. You sort of, you know, pause and you digest and you go, there's a TV in the bedroom. And she goes, yeah. But the way she said it was, she said, the younger brother won't turn off his TV in the bedroom. So I say, what do you mean by his TV? And she goes, well, he's the younger brother, they share a bedroom and they've each got a TV at the end of their bed. And you're going, okay, so the older brother's 10 years off and trying to sleep after doing his homework, and he's effectively being asked to entirely self-manage at age 15. And his younger brother, who had severe ADHD, is not turning his off, you know, and there's no solution to that, you know, like, and then that's part of the problem is you come into a place as a young man thinking, you know, like everybody can be helped. There's always a solution, you know, you come in with big ideas and a lot of those are very good, but you face realities where it's like, if you talk about unnecessary harm, well, that's, that I don't know if that could be a better definition of unnecessary harm than that experience. And that's just one child among many. I mean, I could sit here for the next 5 hours and tell you these stories. I'll tell you of the girl who was kicked out by her mum and dad. Again, her dad wasn't around, and mum kicked her out because there was a party at her house, and one of the girls that the mum allowed to happen at her house. When I say party, I mean obviously a lot of drinking, potentially some drugs, but maybe not, you know. One of the girl's friends is dating a 19-year-old drug dealer. You know, they all turn up. It's getting a bit raucous. The parent tells those boys to leave, so they go downstairs, key the mum's car. So the mum gets really angry, even though she's facilitated the whole process, and kicks the daughter out. Her dad doesn't really want her, but kind of, so she can't stay at her dad's place, even though he doesn't live too far away. So she stays at this friend's house who'd brought this older boy along, and you're going on this, and they're going, you couldn't write this stuff, you know, if you wrote this as a storyline TV show, people would go, a bit far-fetched, mate, you know, rein it in a bit, you know. And so if you talk again, and these, you know, not every child, of course, is like this, but in certain environments, in certain locations, you will end up with higher instances of these situations, and or you can't change any of that. So the answer comes down to, well, the question always leads to, well, what can you change? What can you help with? And that clearly, and it talk about what you were talking about a minute ago. This is a classic chicken or egg, where it's like, well, what comes first? You know, is this about, as a teacher, I want to be able to, as you put it, teach the imperative. I want to teach the guts of what my subject that I'm trying to teach. But if a kid can't access that, then well, it might not be my responsibility as the teacher. In fact, actually, I honestly don't think it is. There is still a gap that needs filling there, and the game seems to be, well, I call myself maybe a bolt-on. Like, there are a lot of different really good programs about, and between us all, the sort of cohesive effort of a lot of these programs to teach those bottom things of either, I believe I can, you know, and there was, everyone talked about growth mentality a few years ago, the idea that potentially I think I can, and therefore if I believe I think I can, then probably statistically I do better than if not. And so I have to get to the heart of how does anybody see themselves? Because if nobody sees themselves well or with possibility and value, and they speak negatively about themselves regularly, how will they ever look towards, you know?
Correct. No.
Anything?
Yeah, no, it's good, man. I mean, again, we could again spend a lot of time on that, and I've had some similar experiences working in juvenile justice, and obviously education as an affective domain educator, not as a school teacher, but being part of those bolt-on programs. I understand full well, but the capacity of what you do and those bolt-on programs, as you've indicated, is very, very important as a really positive addendum to the teaching faculty. And I think that's really important. And your work clearly does that. Now, you've sort of started on this, and the next question kind of follows up on the previous one, but it's, you don't have to repeat the same answer. If it's the same answer, just say, look, see above. But basically, so what are some of the consistent key factors you see in derailing the development of students, but particularly young boys? You know, obviously the TV thing, and the absentee father thing seems to have popped up in at least the three anecdotes you've shared. So what do you think are some of the consistent key factors in derailing the development of young people, particularly young men?
Yeah,
in your settings.
And look, you are similar, but maybe it's too simple an answer, and not being an educational psychologist, just being somebody who reads about these things. Certainly, anecdotally, my experience of London, and again, I talk about one geographical area, but we see these patterns across the world, particularly in young people. I read a very interesting article a couple of years ago about a boy at a barbecue who argued with his mother and was extremely rude. He was a young teenager, and the father wasn't around, and the guy who wrote the article actually stepped in and told this boy off, even though he wasn't the parent and the mother hadn't asked him to. And the boy was sort of like, who are you to tell me? And he basically sort of did the big man thing and said, well, I'm the adult man. I'm telling you, you can't do that, But and it was obviously quite awkward, socially very awkward. But it was like, he then said, listen, why don't you come camping with my son? And he regularly, he took this kid under his wing and they went camping and he looked after him. But he argued in the article that young men reach an age where they are bigger and stronger than their mums, and it happens just after puberty, typically 13, 14, is the typical age that a young man will actually physically get bigger. And, as we've talked, I've chatted with you privately in the past, I think it's like 4 times, their bodies have 4 times the level of testosterone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which drives them to grow, right?
In fact, there's some stat data is 800 times more during.
Okay, so my dad might be. That was a long time. I think that comes up. My dad is probably a bit outdated there, but it's there. We all know it's there, right? And so if you've got this sort of like not anger rage, but this raging system thrumming away, and it wants to challenge. It's actually it's there on purpose. It's built in to
correct.
Use them and grow them and get them to test the world, and I think we've had conversations before where like the ideas of adolescence haven't existed in other cultures in the past and things like that, and you've got this idea of this is you turning into a man and going and doing and being productive in these things. But the problem with that is if that's like anything that's chaotic and powerful without any sort of like it's bowling. Like if you throw a bowling ball super hard down somewhere, it's going to smash whatever it's in its pathway. And if you want to keep it down the middle of the track, it needs. And if you're young, and you don't know how to do it. It needs the bumpers, right? It's a
Yeah.
terribly cheap analogy, but the reality is these guys are bowling balls, and you've got to have, typically speaking, some of the man who maybe has also gone through that themselves, but then just kind of innately seems to. And again, like, people will talk about all sorts of ideas around sort of gender and identity and those things. But aside from those conversations, what seems to work, in my experience, and I talk entirely experientially here, is that you need an older man or an older adult, at least, somebody who is willing to go, I'm not having a bar of that. And they come against it, and they reform it, and then they shape it. And the kid learns very fast. This bit worked, that bit didn't work. That's how to manage that. Well, I said in talk before, when a child's young, you don't give them the keys to the Ferrari, but and you shout at them if they're going to cross a road incorrectly. You are stronger, and all parents will do that. And then, but the kid is very powerful, particularly the young man is a powerful creature. For needs an adult man and the best results I've ever got with young men in particular are the ones where you are very straight-laced and often entirely harsh with them in a kind, safe, and loving way. Where
of course,
I'm not having a bar of that, and you and I both know what you just gave me is about 50% of what you're capable of, or 20% of what you're capable of, and you're annoyed because yours isn't as good as the bloke next to you, but we all know why. So you get to decide whether you want it to be. Like you have to make that choice. And that kind of forming. But as we, and again, I there are so many factors, and this is none of these complete isolation, but that is,
of course,
you've pointed out. If you asked me about every single one of the kids that I could tell you about, there will invariably be the theme of the father missing. And the kids who are naughty, who have the father around, are far more driven down a pathway of kind of cheekiness and sort of like laddiness, as opposed to really difficult behavior. Like it's almost always got more of like the kids actually are right. They're tricky to deal with, but they're not really lost and wandering, if you know what I mean. And that's a different set of things. But I would argue that what we've talked about there with the fatherlessness stuff is
well, that's interesting. Again, without oversimplifying it, I think what you're talking about is a role model, boundary setting, targeted meaningful exercises, and what we've lost in our Western culture, without drilling down into this anthropological space, is rites of passage, which pretty much everyone culture outside the Western culture. And even until 70 years ago, we still had rites of passage. I mean, universities were a new advent. Even law and accounting were all done in the workplace. You hit puberty, there was no adolescence. It was your puberty. You're now an adult, and we're going to put you in adult roles, and we're going to train you in adult faculties. And there's an expectation there. Again, you've got role model, expectation, and which is the very things you've encapsulated in your work, Bryn. And that's really important. Now, I don't want to revisit a lot of the trauma that these kids experience, but how much, you've indicated already, and to some extent, how much does alcohol and other drugs play into their environment, both as shaping them and as they act out? Is that, do they come from environments where alcohol and other drugs are consistently used, or do they find themselves using alcohol and other drugs to present a certain way, or are they using it to self-medicate?
As
all the above.
Be a clear mixture of all of the above. And I think you sort of mentioned earlier in our chat this afternoon, this morning, in my case, the different young people you pointed out correctly. That model I was just talking about with the father and the young man in particular. The young person, each young person, those are good sort of generic principles that, generally speaking, do work. But an individual needs an individual set of responses. And well, our job as educators and people, the access point to the young person is to provide similar systems and safe places where they understand what's going on within that space. There's loads of evidence to suggest that actually just having a set of really tight class rules doesn't work. You actually need to be like, no, we've got a good standard in our classroom, and you need to choose to meet it. I'm not going to give you because each child will connect with that differently, and therefore different consequences may actually be the right pathway with those guys, within a sort of safe kind of mindset. But I think that Oh man, I'm sorry, I've lost my track. What was your question again? I got a bit off.
No, just about the the impact of alcohol and other drugs. You said all three.
Yeah,
It can be acting out. It can be trying to be grown up. It can be because their environments are they're immersed in that kind of environment, or it could be because they're self-medicating.
No, exactly right. It's a combination of all of those things that you've mentioned because there's a really interesting little sort of like pocket of this conversation, which is around cultural marijuana use, for instance, where there's a high, and again, you don't want to be too generic here, but, certain cultures that have ended up in London will have a sort of a prevalent marijuana use. And that, interestingly, is both historically cultural, and I'm talking about like kind of the broader, aspect there, but I'm also talking about then mixed in with like the localized use, so so effectively environment plays a huge role here, whether that is, cultural, you've seen your father do it, the men in the area do it, people do it, it's normal, it's normalized, right?
Of course.
And that's like your family and your family members, people who look like you, or whether that is your the area that you live in, and that's again the norm there, and it's about what in the same way, interestingly, that the flip side to this is my very wealthy mates who've been to private school here, they say that they will quite honestly and happily say the drug problem in those schools is far more prevalent and much worse than the average state school, with much more expensive and potentially quite dangerous drugs, like in terms of immediate impact and danger. So it's environment, right? But then you've got the issues of, well, the self-medication's a fascinating one because it's like hopelessness is a big part of that, and so sometimes you're self-medicating the pain, but sometimes if there's a hopelessness scenario going on, well why wouldn't you, like it feels good, it's fun, everybody's doing it, this seems normal, there's literally no reason not to, and there's never been I grew up in a quite an overt and obvious framework of this is where this leads, and it's really like a bad move, it would lead you to dangerous spaces, you want to be careful with this stuff, and that's very deeply built into me given my background that we talked about. But a lot of people have never had any of that, and so it tends to be, and I would say it's not just across some of the cultures I would say right across the echelons of sort of the structures of society here. My friends, if you want to go to class system, my friends of every different class system here would treat particularly marijuana in a very laissez-faire kind of, it's and we're talking inside the church, outside the church, there's not a lot of difference in my experience talking to people. We're talking across all structures of society. There just seems to be a much more, it's okay, that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
I don't
Normalization.
Yeah. And which is, so those are, geography is huge, culture is huge, hopelessness is huge. And then I suppose you've got to talk about access,
Of course.
And access is access, and yeah. And so
that's good, mate. Look, I think that's indicative of a lot of particularly Western cultural frameworks.
Yeah.
And of course, cannabis is the most widely used substance on the planet. And again, the gold standard for the bad actors in the culture is to normalize. And once you normalize, then it becomes an entrenched quality of your culture, good or bad, doesn't matter, because normal means good means right, and right means true. So that's kind of the way it works, regardless of the perceived or real outcomes of that behavior.
That's right. I mean,
and that's really.
Sorry to interject. I know my wife sometimes talks about the difference between like sort of moral failures and cultural failures, and the idea that when you in a culture, and this is particularly interesting given I'm from multiple cultures, really, like I kind of carry multiple cultural identities within me, and an amalgamation of those things. But if you go to one place and something that seems offensive and to use a religious term, but I use it in a generic sense, like sinful, it's like so to challenge that norm that you just talked about, mate, is this do you really, is this a good idea what you're smoking, is it helping you, etc. It actually feels to them offensive, because in the culture the challenge directly like that is not a cultural conversation which goes on very easily in certain stratospheres. Interestingly, within what people would call the working class or even the underclass in England, I've heard some of these terms used across the years, you can challenge far more directly and have a much healthier conversation than you can with some of those what people would call
Interesting.
upper or higher class things.
Interesting.
I don't want that. So you've got a lot of culture plays into these conversations. Interestingly,
Yeah.
You know? And a young person that I will work with will invariably happily have a conversation with me about these issues where the adults won't. Interestingly.
Yeah. It's interesting, the ethical / moral context and framework. And we talk about best practice. And I think that's one of the things that Delgado Institute does. And we engage the alcohol and other drug issue from a best practice perspective, which includes ethical, moral, health, behavioral. All those factors are key issues. And of course, behavioral medicine, it really is about changing behaviors. And you change behaviors, you change your health outcomes. So and the term sinful, you use the word sinful, and it's sinful to wreck your body. The argument is, well, it's my body, I want to do what I want to do. And the pro-drug actors are great to tell you they claim these faux human rights. It's interesting, the bad actors in the culture. My human right for privacy, my human right for autonomy, and my human right to do what I want with my own body. And some of those rights are actually not found in human rights charters, but it's interesting how they use that. But of course, if you live on your own in an island and there's no other person involved in your life, then you knock yourself out, and you literally will knock yourself out. But when you're in a culture, in a setting, the interplay and interaction with people around you is really, really important. And how we engage with our networks, and this is part of what education does as well. How we engaging, and one of the things that I think is really concerning is that once we become more and more individualistic and we become less and less concerned about our neighbour. In fact, British common law and Commonwealth common law basically have what they call the neighbour principle, which goes right back to, I think you mentioned some sort of biblical context, but it's love your neighbour as yourself. That's actually the foundation of British common law. It's still in play, and it's like, well, and that's not a moral thing so much as a socio, if you like, political thing. It's like I care about the community I'm in, how it functions well, safely, healthfully, wisely, caringly, and all those things are very important. And once we lose that affective domain, once that goes out, then the cognitive domain can't replace that. You just give people more information or more capacity to try and manage the damage that they're creating because their affect is so bad. Then you've got this mess that keeps being piled up, and people say education is the solution. I argue, well, which education are you talking about? Are you talking about more data, more information, more clever concepts and ideas, or are you talking about the affective domain? Why? Why? What are the parameters? What are the ethical, emotional, social, moral parameters that we're engaging in? How is that affecting the way we live and develop, and how we help others live and develop? As you've just said, it's interesting when dad disappears for whatever reason, and he wants to go and do whatever. And we don't want to make all dads who leave as bad guys, because there's always three sides to the story. But when a father leaves a home and leaves mum to the kids, and grandparents are involved, and then there's alcohol and other drugs to cope, and you've got deficits, and then you've got toxic additives. And of course, that environment right there is educating that person and developing, as you've seen. And then you have to come along with your intervention. Now, I've spent over 10 years working in affective domain, and I've been into schools, and I've spoken to just over 100,000 students myself over a long period of time. And it's interesting, we talk about building, giving a sense of self, and this is part of what you're talking about. And I love the fact that you don't really use the word self-esteem. It's an industry term that was created by a non-psychological psychologist kind of arena. It was more of an industry term created for the sake of marketing. So we're developing self-esteem, but it's caught on. It's become a meme. And there's actually a great book that challenges that. It's called Beyond the Myth of Self-Esteem, Finding Fulfillment by a fellow by the name of Dr. Kevin John Smith. Brilliant book, worth getting for those listening. That book's called Beyond the Myth of Self-Esteem, Finding Fulfillment. But we used to go into schools and ask this question. We'd say, so for the sake of this conversation, hey guys, hands up in the room, 300 kids, what is self-esteem? And you get the hands go up, how you see yourself, positive outlook of yourself, blah, blah, blah. We had 1 year 10 girl put her hand up one time. Brilliant response. Floored everybody. And it shifted the way we saw things. This is going back about 25 years ago. She said, it's self-esteem is something your parents give you at home and you come to school to have it taken away. So the question we asked was, and then literally 5 to 6 years into that exercise, we used to bring the anecdote to the floor, and we had teachers start to tell us 20 years ago, you know what, that's true of a lot of kids, but it's also the other way around. Kids come to school to get self-esteem, they go home to have it taken away.
Yeah.
And the question is, regardless of who's depositing and who's taking it, the fact is, if it's self-esteem, it can't be taken from you and it can't be given to you. It's self-esteem. That's why the whole thing is a difficult concept to work. So we have to actually create, and you're doing that, environments where young people find a sense of self beyond the internal mechanisms, but at the same time building capacity in them, because they realize that there's a number of factors that they don't have that are external to them that they need to engage. And this is part of teaching them. And then all of a sudden building that capacity because they've had internal input. That's what education does. Now, the question here, that the tactile medium, I love the craft that you just tried and tested. Again, that tactile engagement, it obviously works with, you know, your eyes, your hands, your coordination, your mind. It touches all those spaces. So it's a brilliant arrangement. It's a great tool. So it does work on a number of youth development metrics. So how did you land in the end on that, Bryn? What was, because there's a number of different mediums you could use, but in the end, what was the kind of thing? I've landed on this because.
Well, that's a great question. If we talk about environments and their impact and experiences and their impact, mine interestingly was built almost entirely of experience. If you're a young man living on a teacher's wage in London, you're in a share house, no doubt about it. And in London, that will mean living in usually a very small room. And in particular, the house I was living at the time, there's a couple of slightly bigger rooms. I'd taken the smaller one, you know, a bit less rent on it. And I literally, it fit my bed. There was a couple of shelves above my bed. I mean, the bed was, I suppose, a door's width away from the door, so the door could open and shut. But we're talking the bed took up essentially the entire length of the room. We're talking about a glorified cupboard, really, is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And there was one very small kind of half height inbuilt cupboard where I could fit some, you know, like teaching outfits, you know, my trousers and shirts and the like. And there was no drawers or anything, so there was no space in the room. And I had thought, how do I create space? Effectively, we're literally talking the room was the size of a bed, plus, you know, maybe a meter from the door and probably 40 centimeters at the end of the bed to the wall on the right hand side, and there was a window. That was the entire room. And I had, in a house I used to live in Australia, a share house with these amazing A-frame shelves, which are like, it was an old ladder, and I had two beams across it, simple shelving solution. I thought, gosh, you know what, like that would do the job. If I can build that, then that would fit into this slot at the end of my bed, and I would suddenly have a whole pile of shelving that I could use. And so I was good friends with the lads who were in the tech department downstairs at school, and I looked online on Gumtree, and I found a bunch of free wood from like a stonemason's place, you know, all crate. And so I thought, I'm going to use those, and I went down to, you know, it was a tricky build because it was all reclaimed wood, which is where the term reclaim comes from in my project.
Of course.
So I started using reclaimed wood, and it was the problem with reclaimed wood is it is not cut true, right? It was once upon a time cut true. By the time I get it, it's twisted out of shape, and these beams on these A-frame shelves, which I've still got, by the way, in my house, they really twist it by, you know, 30 or 40 degrees around. There's very long beams, and so if you're trying to build an A-frame that is effectively doing that when it meets, you've got a really tricky bunch of mathematical issues to do to cut the lines so that things fit in straight and the like. So I had to really kind of like, it really fought against me, essentially, in order to build this thing. And that built the foundation for my project, in that this idea of reclamation. At the same time, it was very popular on Instagram, and everybody was using like distressed.
Yeah. It was a trendy thing for a while, wasn't it? Yeah.
Trendy thing for a while to distress stuff was the idea. Chalk paint, distress, you know. But I still use chalk paint because it's interesting. The tactile sense of it is really nice, and it has like, it also is very easy medium that it goes on everything. So practically it works really well. But as I was doing these things, I took some pallets in terms of coffee tables, like everybody was doing at the time, and it was a popular sort of thing. But the idea again of you've got something which effectively doesn't fit a context, and you turn it into something that you're looking towards, and it was never that thing. And then so there's this very simple metaphor of I've reclaimed this thing. Nothing is too gone that it's to be thrown out, and that allows me to facilitate a load of conversations in schools, because essentially the way my project works is I do conversations with the young people, then we do the work, and within that, then I invite them into something you said before about the rites of passage, to hand a young person, and I do it down to about year 4, occasionally year 3, up to typically around year 8, but sometimes year 9 or 10, depending on the students I'm working with. So we're talking sort of 8 years old up to about 15, sometime 15, 16.
Wow.
If you hand a young person a hammer, they will understandably and very wisely just typically innately be scared of the hammer, because it's a dangerous tool, and it's something that they almost always will not have dealt with much before. And so, and particularly with the way technology in classrooms is headed this way, it's all headed much more towards like laser cutting machines and the design process, understandably with the world we live in, machines are actually doing most stuff. And so what we might have done in wood tech when we were at school, less of that is happening. It's starting a bit, but less. And so their exposure to these adult things isn't there. And interestingly, I was always worried about the danger of handing a young person a hammer. Turns out it's not really there. Kids won't ever hurt each other with a hammer, because they recognize the danger of it. They're dealing with a weapon effectively, and they know it will hurt them if they use it incorrectly. And there's just a very human, very simple, very deeply written thing of, I don't want to get burnt today. And so they will be quite scared. And so there's a level of challenge to it, that. And then so the idea is I take this reclaimed wood and I say, look, guys, use the wood which somebody else has thrown out. This has been rubbish. Let's turn it around. And then I tell them a bit about me. Beautiful. And I feel like sometimes in my experiences, and I talk to them about the fact that they will all have the same story. Some around before year 3, they all quite enjoyed school. When they're in primary, they're little, they had fun. It was fun. You played in the sandbox. You built some stuff. You were just doing the building blocks, which are really engaging. By year 3 or 4, kids always end up saying, I don't really want to go to school at some point. Now, that's very normal. There's plenty of normal things. That's not a big sort of story there. But then what you said before happens, which is true, which is that if a student continually sees a lack of success across a platform, whether that's a spelling test at a young age or a maths test, a similar sort of thing, or older, and then in this country, typically people put them in sets. And so by year 7, by the end of year 7, the school will have seen what they're like, and then they'll put them in ability sets. So then you get shoved into set 4, and often there might be 2 sides to the year level, so there'll be 2 set 4 classes, and you will then typically be in set 4 in most of your classes. And this is all identity. We were talking a moment ago about identity-driven, of person. Self-esteem, right? It's like, well, what's myself? My self-story. My story informs my view of myself, and my story is that I don't do too.
And the environment keeps shaping that view, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
One of the best things about Australia is that we have a high value for people who, I think culturally, we value people who don't see themselves as academic, and they hold a just as valuable place in the society as anybody else. Certainly among my friends, I had a really even split between academic types and much more practical types, and actually all my practical type mates didn't have university debt and went on and did really well and built their own houses. And I kind of think, good, that might have been a nice pathway, but I here academia is still really pushed, and it's very strongly, and obviously you've got complex issues like Britain was part of the EU for a long time. The freedom of movement of people meant that people from other countries would fill a lot more practical jobs. Therefore, young people maybe aren't seeing those as possible pathways the way they may be used, or maybe culture, but they certainly get the sense of this culture we live in isn't value. And so you've got this problem of value that we're talking about, and why I think value is because it has been taught to them by their environment. And while there are, and that's not to say that the education system is getting a lot wrong in terms of
I hear
support systems for kids who are, and they're always trying to come up with new ways, and it's actually phenomenal. But the problem is that you find out that despite a whole cultural shift towards we help students, every child matters was the theme that they used here a few years ago. The idea being that you never leave a child behind. Every kid, you help them, you offer all the support, etc. There is a truckload of support available to young people. So why is it that we have a teacher shortage and we have way more exclusions than we've ever had in this country before, right? So there's got to be some other questions in there. And so,
Yeah.
as you
And they're
correctly,
questions you're trying to answer, which I think is really powerful.
this is why this is not. This is the mistake of everybody comes in and says we're going to fix education. Education's never has never really been the problem here. You know, the problem is kids recognizing need, and if you don't recognize, you know, one of the interesting things about poverty in education is that in every nation where people have gained it's a simple education, like a straight education, poverty starts to decline quite rapidly, right? But then you get to the point where people don't feel like they necessarily have a need for it, and they don't feel like, you know, there's the possibility of what's my life if I don't get this, and there's not the reality, and all of that again ties into value. And you kind of go, well, if a kid doesn't see anything as valuable and themselves as valuable, and what do I have to offer, those sorts of things, then so this idea of the reclaim stuff comes in and goes, well, who are you and how do you see? My main questions are, who are you? How do you see the world? You know, and let's talk about
that's good. It's interesting. Yeah. I'll jump in on that because last year when we launched the World Resiliency Day, our platform was a soft launch. We launched it on the WAY, W-A-Y, who are you? And it's a really important question because one thing about resilient people is they have a sense of identity. I mean, identity, I think the famous psychologist, Dr. Larry Crabb, and his landmark work 26 years ago called Inside Out, he said three things that everyone needs, you know, true identity, true intimacy, relationship, and impact. And I think they're the things that you're kind of sewing in. Interesting, some of the productive evidence-based outcomes of your work, which it's very, very important for our listeners to understand this, on disengaged students are character development, higher self-worth. I love that you don't use the word self-esteem, increased worth and capability, the ability to re-engage in the classroom, and more enjoyment in education. Now, there's a key. Teaching the kids to like learning is the key issue. Once they've got that, they're more resilient when it comes to failure. They're more resilient when it comes to disappointment in the journey of, you know, success, because they will fail. They will stuff up. They will do something wrong. But because they want to learn and they have an enjoyment in learning, that failure or that hiccup doesn't knock them about. Now, these are all really powerful, but you do get emotions fail us. They all fail us. I'm an emotionally fragile person. My personality belies that, but I am a very emotionally fragile person, and I get knocked about really easy. You want to knock the wind out of me, there's some very easy things to do to knock the wind out of me. But I've learned resiliency. I'm not an innately positive person. It's not who I am. But what I've learned over the years is some of the things that you're teaching here. And one of the things I liked in looking at your program is you talk about your red flag scenarios. And I just want to sort of wind up as we this time together, mate, is you talk about on your blog particularly how easy it is to get caught up in symptoms and fail to engage the causal factors, which we've been talking about. Talk to us about some of the vulnerable moments with your students and what helps create that space to share and receive input for them, because I think that's a real key to what you do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that I would say that this is very personal to my experience at this stage, but my first learning in England was they speak a different set of cultural values here than at home. So in Australia, we are very driven around truth and kind of authenticity, and this is the reality, you know. And if you have you say a thing, there will often be a response to the thing in a reasonably clear way. One of the things I came across here in particular was the language that gives you access to young people is a language of respect and loyalty. And if you can show young people that, they will listen to you and they will start to respond to you. You know, there's a couple of things going on in the background to that. One of them is that's a long-term game. It doesn't work. The reason it's a long-term game is it creates chaos early on, because early on what I'm saying is I value you despite what you're doing. And so I'm not going to be too harsh on you, too etc., too whatever, because at this early stage I'll hold my standards, and I'm not wishy-washy. It's not my personality at all to be wishy-washy, but I'm not those things. But I've always had much more chaotic, to some people they'd seem very chaotic classrooms, but typically those students would then succeed at a higher rate than some other students across a 2-year program of GCSE. And the reason is that my whole drive is, I'm not just giving you the thing, but I'm going to tell you that you're going to be able to do it, and I'm going to invite you into that space. And bit by bit, I'm going to be showing you that you can do it. But it's a very tiring, actually, model, and it takes a longer time than just the strict model, which keeps people under control and allows them to. And while those things are needed and those sorts of things, there is a lot to be said for. These are tricky things in that you've got to come up with a language that the student you're talking to will understand, and that will be very, very, very culturally driven. And again, I mean both like sort of cultures in the wider sense of the word, but also the locality and what they've come across, and respect and the way students function within respect. Respect is almost never innately given to an adult in the culture I work in, and so that the respect and the access to a person and the right to speak to them effectively is in some ways earned here. And I don't think that's a good model, but it's the reality of the model I work in. And so the idea of a young person, no, mate, you're safe, and I will like you regardless of who you are, unless you're really nasty, in which case I'm not going to allow you to poison my environment. But they are few and far between, there's a lot of chaos. But
last question, Bryn. This question we ask most of our guests, and it's a simple question. Your preference, fence or ambulance? Which one?
Fence, did you say?
Fence or ambulance?
As in like fence that divides a garden? Is that the kind of fence you're talking about?
Yeah, fence at the top of the cliff or ambulance at the bottom? How's that?
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, you'd take fence, wouldn't you? Yeah. Although, I mean, as much, I would say that's, if I'm really honest with you, my current thinking is fence for the majority, and we're talking the high majority, but there is historical writings that I read regularly. We're talking 3,000-4,000 years old. We're talking, as long as stuff's been written down, people have been writing stuff down that says there's no point teaching a fool, is the phrase that gets used. Essentially what they're suggesting is a person has to have a level of choosing to join in before you can access them. And if they don't want the fence, the ambulance will be the only thing that will teach them. So it's a tricky question, and it's a real tragedy, and it's not something any of us want. We all want to put the fence in for the young person, but the reality is there's a level where you go fence, and then eventually you go, okay, I'm not going to bother. And actually I have a responsibility not to bother because, on a very simple level of should I give you a chance if you don't put your hand up in class? Like, you actually know that rule, and I probably shouldn't give you a free chance on that. That's not a fence moment. That's an ambulance moment, actually, where you need to recognize that and that very simple principle, and that scales all the way up into the big one, which is that is if we can all do what we want to help you as best as we can, and we can all, but at some point you will have to choose or not choose.
Comprehensive answer, my friend, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Bryn Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit more about not just your Reclaim project, but what it is to build resiliency, what it is to help young people avoid unnecessary harm, and most importantly, not most importantly, but as importantly, stay away from substances, which just unravel everybody. Bryn Murphy, thanks for joining us. Until next time, people, stay safe.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm Podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.